principle for the commitments Lakehead has made both in Northwestern Ontario and Simcoe County, and will continue to guide our efforts in the future. Before we begin, I would like to share an important notice of video recording of the Treaties Recognition Week events. Participants are reminded that this online event is being recorded and that we are doing this to preserve a record of the event in the university's archives and to publicize and promote Lakehead University. By attending, you are agreeing to be included in the recording and its public dissemination in any media now known or later developed anywhere in the world in perpetuity. If you wanted to watch the event again or you wanted to share it with a friend, certainly this is really incredible speakers we've had this week. We will put the link in the chat, but it will be at lakeheadu.ca/Indigenous in the university's YouTube channel. Any questions participants have can be entered into the Zoom chat, and we will address those towards the end of the presentation. Thank you for joining us. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Linda Rodenberg, Director of Community Engagement and Lifelong Learning. Welcome, Linda.
Thanks so much, Denise. I'm so excited to be here, and I've been so excited to be part of our communities at Lakehead as we have been working together in Treaties Week. And also, I think I've really noticed in our community here in Orillia over the past 6 weeks that there's been a real spirit of reconciliation. And so I'm so happy to see so many people here today that are making this part of their lifelong learning process. I'm especially excited today to welcome Brian Charles as our speaker, as our keynote for this event. Brian is a dear friend, and he has been a really amazing part of our Orillia community here. He's spoken in classes, and he's been really a meaningful person for our students in terms of their learning around wampum in particular. But also, I just have to acknowledge his generosity of spirit. It really is second to none. Brian is an off-reserve band member of the Chippewas of Georgina Island. He's worked collaboratively with a small group of knowledge keepers to research and assemble a physical repository of wampum belts connected to Ojibwe history. And he's going to be sharing what he's learned and his knowledge about those things with us today. So I'm going to stand up and invite Brian to take this seat, and we'll be learning today from him. Thank you so much, Brian.
Nana Bojo, DJ Anishinaabe Nene, Yutash Noten Indigenous Kas, Muskanoje Indodem. Maybe we'll start with Ani, Ani, Ani. That's kind of the Ojibwe version of all right, all right, all right. Happy to be here today. Happy to share a little bit of this, this knowledge and some of these stories and some of this history. And we will be having a time at the end of our session today for questions. I see that we also have the chat up and operating, so I'll leave that to our administrators to keep an eye on that while we kind of get into some of these things here today. Same law has been passed, so we do have that on the table as well today for our considerations. I'll put that there just below the monitor. I'll start by maybe sharing just a few little things that I am not an elder. I don't consider myself so. I don't use the title. And so I am one of the people, community member, and walking on the same layer of this earth as everybody else. So I'll ask you to keep that in mind, that pedestals wobble when you put a guy my size up on top of a pedestal. So don't do that. I'll appreciate that. Going to share with you the stories that have been shared with me. And so in doing that, that we broaden the knowledge base and maybe this understanding, and provide even today in our short session, maybe it will be fundamental, maybe it will be foundational, so that we can move forward together on our path after today. Some of you might know me from previous presentations or previous interactions, which is wonderful, and maybe a whole lot of you might be the first time having this type of interaction with me. So we look forward to this opportunity of building the relationship. For myself, I grew up off reserve. And so for a very long time in my life, grew up without these teachings. I do not carry the language. I'm not fluent in the language. So please don't make that assumption that I am a student and learning. And so part of that led to some work a number of years ago now around the War of 1812. And so for Indigenous peoples, in my mind, in my thinking, that experience was a turning point, a very important turning point and change time for our ancestors that still, in my mind, continue to impact us today. As part of that work, began learning about wampum. And so in my presentation, it is wampum related to Anishinaabe history, that there may be some crossover, there will be some crossover to Iroquoian history, culture a little bit, but I need to be very, very clear here at the beginning that I do not speak on behalf of Iroquoian people, do not speak on behalf of Longhouse. And so if you're looking for more information about how wampum connects to those communities, you need to go and find someone from those communities that can speak to that I will not be speaking on their behalf. There are wampums that cross cultures, cross nations, and there are wampums that are very, very specific to nations themselves and their relationships. So we need to understand that today is an introductory session, and we can begin this journey. For me, the light went on, or the red flags got waving, doing research for the War of 1812. And in that research, as we were trying to find out the ancestors from our communities here at the Tri-Council, so today's communities of Georgina Island, of Rama, and Beausoleil First Nation on Christian Island, trying to track down really the main goal was to find the list of names of our ancestors that had served as nation-to-nation allies. So that's an important consideration, important languaging there. Nation-to-nation allies of the British during the War of 1812, not as subjects of the crown. Okay, very, very different. Not as subjects, but as nation-to-nation allies. So we began this work. And in part of that research, I came across a document that came from a council in 1840, down in a territory that is today essentially Mississauga, Ontario. For those of you who know Southern Ontario, just a little ways outside of Toronto. And so the document I'm going to read to you. Minutes of a General Council meeting, Chiefs Yellowhead reading of wampum belt given by the Six Nations to the Chippewas during the French regime. Chief Yellowhead was the head man at Rama. And so for the Tri-Council, that Chief John Assance at this time was the head chief, the head man for Beausoleil First Nation. John Snake was the head man for what is now the community of Georgina Island. And so Yellowhead was the head man for the community of Rama. And in much of the historical documentation, the British seemed to elevate him above the other two and refer to him as the head man of what was then referred to as the Chippewas of Lakes Huron and Simcoe, referring to those three modern day communities as they were around the time of 1812. And so the transcript reads as such. Chief Yellowhead rose up and made a speech and exhibited the great wampum belt of the Six Nations and explained the talk contained in it. This wampum was about 3 feet long and 4 inches wide. It had a row of white wampum in the center, running from one end to the other, and the representations of wampum every now and then, and a large round wampum tied nearly the middle of the belt. with a representation of the sun in the center. Yellowhead stated that this belt was given by the Nottaways, Iroquois people, to the Ojibways many years ago, about the time the French first came to this country. That the Great Council took place at Lake Superior, that the Nottaways made the road or path and pointed out the different council fires which were to be kept lighted. The first marks on the wampum represented that a council fire should be kept burning at the Sault Ste. Marie. The second mark represented the council fire at Manitoulin Island, where a beautiful white fish was placed who should watch the fire as long as the world stood. The third mark represents a council fire placed on an island opposite Penetanguishene Bay, on which was placed a beaver to watch the fire. The fourth mark represents a council fire lighted up at the narrows of Lake Simcoe, at which place was put a white reindeer. To him, the reindeer was committed the keeping of this wampum talk. At this place, our fathers hung up the sun and said that the sun should be a witness to all that had been done, and that when any of their descendants saw the sun, they might remember the acts of their forefathers. At the narrows, our fathers placed a dish with ladles around it, and a ladle for the 6 nations, who said to the Ojibways that the dish or bowl should never be empty. But he, Yellowhead, was sorry to say that it had already been empty, not by the 6 nations on the Grand River, but by the Ganawages residing near Montreal. The fifth mark represents a council fire which was placed at this river credit, where a beautiful white-headed eagle was placed upon a very tall pine tree in order to watch the council fires and see if any ill winds blew upon the smoke of the council fires. A dish was also placed at the credit, that the right of hunting on the north side of the lake was secured to the Ojibways, and that the 6 nations were not to hunt here, only when they came to smoke the pipe of peace with their Ojibwe brethren. The path on the wampum went from the credit over to the other side of the lake, the country of the 6 nations. Thus ended the talk of Yellowhead and his wampum. So in coming across this document, although it is years after the War of 1812, when we were going through that research process, we're pulling out any kind of historical document we could find that was attached to Chief Snake, Chief Yellowhead, and Chief Ascents. And so we pull out this document and we find this story. And so that was the light going on for myself about wampum related to Ojibwe history. And so the journey began there. As we were wrapping up the work around the War of 1812, then this new adventure kind of settled in with me. And what I'm going to share with you today is some of the information that I've learned from this wampum journey. So wampum, one of the things that we talk about, and I'll keep an eye on time here. I think we have about half an hour to go, 40 minutes before we leave some time for questions at the end of the session. One of the pieces that gets talked about quite often for Indigenous peoples in certainly Eastern Woodland and probably all across North America is that Indigenous peoples didn't write things down, didn't have a writing system, which is completely false. It's inaccurate, it's untrue, and there are multiple ways of disproving that. Because there were multiple ways of writing things down that Indigenous peoples used. Simply wasn't done with a pen and a piece of paper. So there are petroglyphs, pictographs, birch bark scrolls, and one of the ways of writing things down was wampum. To create a record, to create an archive, a way of storing knowledge, of storing information, so that that knowledge could be handed down to future generations. And so when we look at wampum, it begins with a shell. And most commonly, the shell that was used was the quahog shell, an East Coast shell. And here are a couple of examples. I'll hold this up and just hold them for, let's see if I can find a spot in the camera and allow it to focus. The inside of the shell, outside of the shell. Now these are small, and you can see that this particular one's been broken and glued back together a few times. But one of the things that is unique about this particular shell is that really, really wonderful purple color on the inside of the shell. Quahog. And so the people would be harvesting the shells. And why were they harvesting the shells? We can ask ourselves. On the inside, that there was a mussel, a clam, an oyster, these kinds of things, right? So on the inside, there is a source of protein, a meat that the people were using for food. And after harvesting that food, then there are a series of shells left over. And so if we look at that particular shell, what we can see is that on that outside edge is very fine. And so you have a natural cutting or scraping tool. That smaller shells can be used as a spoon, larger shells used for a cup, larger shells used for a bowl. And so very utilitarian, that we often hear these stories that Indigenous peoples used every aspect of everything that they grew, harvested, or collected. And that was necessary for survival. And so with these shells, it wasn't simply just for food source and then cast away the shell itself. No, that the shell was used for many other things, even after the food had been harvested. At some point, someone probably drops a shell. And when they drop on a hard surface, they kind of shatter into pieces. And so even when the shells were broken, that they still were not thrown out, that they found a use for those. In some ways they were used. You have to excuse that one of these pieces is broken for ornamentation. Sorry. So there's a pair of modern day earrings made out of quahog shell. One piece has been broken. I do need to have that repaired. So we see them used as ornamentation, as bracelets, as necklaces, jewelry. We also then see, as this evolves, that the shell is then manufactured or formed into small cylindrical tubular beads. If I can hold that up, I mean, you can see those different beads. And then laced on strings. So the string themselves, in the historical record, it talks about a hemp fiber or split spruce root. So if you dig a spruce, you can clean the earth off those roots. You can peel off the outside of that, the outside layer of that bark. And then on the inside, the material that is left, you can actually split those roots down into a thread-like material. So we know that there were different ways of using natural elements and creating thread. So one of the things that we ask people to think about is that, how did they do that? You can see the size of those wampum beads. And if we can get a shot of that on the camera. So there's a small hole down through the center. So of course, these ones in modern times are made with modern day tools. So one of the pieces we ask you to consider is that, stop that from swinging around. We ask you to consider is that how did those ancestors, how did those relatives make those beads? Because we have to keep in mind that this system was developing and in place before the time of contact. That's important to consider because before the time of contact, there was no hardened metal here. There was no tool steel in the Eastern woodlands. So no material that you can make what we would know of today as a modern day drill bit, a saw, a file, a pair of pliers, a pair of vice grips, a Dremel, any of those things. And yet they had the intelligence, the creativity, the capacity to investigate and learn and find ways of creating these small tubular beads. So I'll ask you to consider that as part of this discussion. Now, at the point of contact, yes, Europeans bring mechanization and bring tool steel. So that changes the world, again, for us in many, many different ways, but specifically with wampum, systems are then put in place to begin the manufacture of wampum beads. So we see those beads put on strings. They may have been multicolored. They may have been all, again, the wobbling back and forth. They may have been strings of all white. They may have been strings of purple and white, and strung in a certain way so that they would begin to record council events. And so when a council was held, then these strings of wampum would be given out to all of the participants, all of the leadership from the different groups, as a form of acknowledging that they had participated in that council, a record of their attendance, and then by accepting that string of wampum, that they pledged to uphold any of the decisions that came out of those individual councils. And so as this system evolves, and we begin to see the wampum are then woven into what are referred to in the historical record as belts. So we need to be careful that they weren't particularly worn as belts to hold up your drawers, to hold up your pants. And it's likely a name certainly that comes from the time of contact, where because they are long and narrow, they look like a belt or a sash, and they take on this name of a belt. But they are wampum. And they were used across many, many different nations all throughout the Eastern Woodland. So I think at some point in the discussion, we need to take our hat off to acknowledge Iroquois communities, because they have certainly maintained a very, very strong relationship with wampum as it relates to their history, their diplomatic relations, and their own cultural practices. So I will acknowledge that. But it goes far beyond Iroquois territory, from the East Coast to Mi'kmaq people, all out through that territory, all across the Eastern Woodland, and even across to the Thunder Bay region, Lakehead, and down south into southern portions, certainly of the Eastern Woodland territory. So a vast, vast section of North America, as we know it today, were participating as Indigenous nations in wampum diplomacy. And the wampum then would be used between two or more groups to record relationship. Wampum diplomacy, international relationships, originally between Indigenous nations, and then as contact takes place, European nations that arrive here recognize that there is a system of diplomacy already in place, that has been in place for a very long time between the different nations of Indigenous peoples across the Eastern Woodland. And they begin to participate fully in the diplomatic system that is already in place within these territories. The French begin to exchange wampum. They fully participate in the system of diplomacy. When the British arrive later, they begin to fully participate in the system of diplomacy that was already existing in this land before their arrival. And they too begin to exchange wampum with Indigenous nations. So we're going to look at a few wampums and provide some examples for you. These are recreations. The samples that I have held up are made from actual shell. These are our authentic quahog shell beads. The wampum that I have with me that are woven into belts are reproductions. And so we can use them then to take out for teaching. Once we get through all of this isolation and COVID stuff, previous to that, and so certainly hoping and looking forward to after we figure this out, so that people can hold them in their hands, so that people can see not just photographs or stills or these things, but actual physical recreations, so that we can use that as a teaching tool, a learning tool, to experience what wampum, as close as we can get in recreation today, to the belts that were around historically. So we're going to start with one that, and again, this is Iroquoian in its origin, and I see that all of a sudden I've just gone really blurry, or I have steam on my glasses. will get the camera to hopefully refocus before I begin showing you this particular wampum. And maybe it's because I move around too much. I'm not sure. Maybe I have to stand more still.
We'll just stop the video.
So we're going to stop the video and start it again. And hopefully the camera, here we go.
You're back. Great.
So if I move really slowly, this belt is kind of the grandparent of wampum understandings, we'll say. It's probably one of the most well-known or best known or maybe most often referred to. So we'll begin here. And again, it is Iroquoian in its origin, and I cannot, will not, do not speak on behalf of Iroquoian peoples, communities, Longhouse, but we will start with this particular wampum. And this is Two Row. As you can see, 2 rows. It's understood that the origin of this wampum comes in 1613. And it is, at one point I had referred to the belt constantly as Iroquoian, and I was then kind of taken by the ear and sat down and talked to by a kindly grandmother from the Six Nations territory. And she described to me that the belt is specifically a Mohawk belt. And in 1613, Mohawk peoples then as today in their society occupy the eastern doorway of the territory. And so when the newcomers arrived in 1613, they understood very, very quickly that they would need to find ways to be able to live and coexist peacefully for each to have a good life. And so the relationship with these peoples was very, very important. And so as that relationship developed, then came Two Row. And it is generally illustrated this way with these 13 rows. And so the white background of the wampum references the river of life, and that this human experience, the people are traveling down a river of life. And so with the arrival of the newcomers, we then see 2 purple pathways on that river of life, one representing Mohawk peoples and the other representing these newcomers that they had encountered. And that first community, that first colony, I suppose we'll say, which you all probably know about. Maybe some of you have traveled to that particular community that was known as New Amsterdam, today referred to as New York City. That New York City was originally a Dutch colony. So that for maybe some of you listening today, participating on the call, that if you have Dutch ancestry in your family tree, then you too have wampum history, a relationship to wampum here in North America. And not just a relationship to it, but also the responsibilities that come with that. And so as they travel down that river of life, one of those purple lines represents that Mohawk vessel, that canoe. The other represents the vessel that the Dutch had traveled on, that ship that had brought them across the ocean. And what we see with this particular wampum is that those lines are equal, that they are the same size, that one is not larger or smaller than the other. So they are equal. That they do not converge, they do not intersect, they do not cross over each other, representing that one does not have the right, the authority, or the privilege to cross over into the other's vessel and tell them how to conduct the affairs of their nation, of their communities, of their families. That they are sovereign, they are independent, and that they travel equally in parallel down that river of life. And so then we see that white background is divided into three. And so then there are teachings that are also connected to those three white bands. So there are many, many teachings that are involved in the symbols that are included on the different wampum. So we'll start here with Two Row Wampum. The next wampum that I want to talk about in a little bit of time that we have is also connected to Iroquoian history, but it is also connected to Anishinaabe history and a few other nations as well. And it comes during a time of conflict between Iroquoian peoples and a number of their different neighbors. And some of those were the neighbors to the north of their territory, on the north side of the Great Lakes. And this particular wampum that the actual wampum lives somewhere today in the basement of the ROM, tucked away. This particular wampum is understood as the dish with one spoon. Sometimes referred to also as the bowl with many ladles, the dish or the bowl and the ladles. And so one of the things that we begin to understand about wampum is that when a wampum was dominantly white, they referred to a peaceful proposal, a peaceful relationship. And so when there were times of conflict, a belt may have been presented or sent to the other side that you were in conflict with. And when it was dominantly white, it was proposing peace or trying to restore peace. So we see that this wampum, of course, is dominantly white. The image in the middle is understood as that dish or that spoon. The dish with one spoon, the bowl with many ladles. The spoon or ladle talk about or reference that many people will have to eat out of that same dish. The dish or the bowl, metaphorically with wampum, refers to a hunting ground, a food source, a harvesting area. And so the proposal is that one dish, that one spoon, I'm sorry, or many ladles, is that many different peoples have to eat out of that dish or that bowl, or use that shared hunting ground for those shared resources. That's the proposal. And so the dish, the bowl, the spoons. Sometimes there is one spoon when it gets discussed. And so if we think about that we all need to learn how to get along, to coexist peacefully, to be able to share those resources. Sometimes we'll have a little bit of fun with this when we go into a grade school or a high school. We say, we're going to take a break for lunch. And for lunch today, there's going to be a great big pot of stew over in the cafeteria. And just so that we can have a learning experience to model our behavior on dish with one spoon, there's going to be that one really big pot of stew, and that there's going to be one spoon, and we all have to share the one spoon. And of course, you get the expected, responses from students. But it's to get them thinking about how would we do that? How would we do that in a sharing way to be able to share that one spoon? In some ways, and in some occasions, the teaching is talked about as many ladles. And so there is the one food source, but there are multiple ladles for every nation or every group of peoples, each getting their own metaphorical spoon to be able to eat from that pot, that dish, that plate, that food source. And so it is a spoon by design. It is not a fork, it is not a knife. If you were to reach in or reach across with a fork or a knife, even accidentally, you could cut, stab, or poke someone else who was reaching in from another part of the pot or the bowl, also to be able to feed themselves, their families, their communities. And so the metaphor is the drawing of blood, of violence, these types of things. Whereas if you reach in with a spoon, the front edge of a spoon is round, it is blunt, it will not cause injury, which is a reminder to us again that we are to be cautious in our relationships with our neighbors, with our neighboring nations. And we are to be thoughtful in our approach to that so that we do not cause injury, that we do not stab, poke, lacerate, cut, anything in how we deal with each other in that shared food source. So the dish with one spoon, an introduction to the dish with one spoon. This wampum is referenced in the reading that I shared with you at the very beginning. If we have time, we'll try and come back to that a little bit. So that dish with one spoon is a proposal for peace during a time of conflict between Iroquois peoples and Anishinaabe Ojibwe peoples. Also, again, referenced in this piece that Yellowhead got up and spoke about when he talked about that particular wampum. We do not have an image of that wampum. There's no hand drawing. There's no photograph. To date, we have not been able to locate the actual wampum if it continues to exist in our world today. But from that reading, this wampum was crafted as to what that wampum may have looked like. So I would not be so bold as or arrogant to say that this is what it looked like, because we do not know. The only thing I can tell you for sure is that it probably didn't look exactly like this. And with this movement, again, I see that we've gone blurry, so we're just going to stop the video for a second and click it back on to allow it to reset. And so in that reading from the archives that Yellowhead talked about, he talked about a belt that was about 3 feet long and 4 inches wide, that had a white line running through the middle of the wampum. The purple background does talk about a time of conflict. Whenever we see a white line or white path running through the purple belt, it refers to a path of peace or a chain of friendship. So in this particular one, we've tried to illustrate that as the path that Yellowhead spoke about in council. And so we see a number of images that relate to those 5 images that Yellowhead talked about. That the first was in Sault Ste. Marie, then Manitoulin Island, then an island opposite Penetanguishene Bay, which today is generally understood or thought to be an island called Beausoleil Island, which is different from Beausoleil First Nation. Beausoleil First Nation today resides on Christian Island. This is a different island, Beausoleil Island. Then it talks about the Narrows at Lake Simcoe and Lake Couchiching. Then it talks about where the council took place down at the Credit River, modern day Mississauga. And so in that reading, it also talks about that there was a fire in each one of these places that was to be kept eternally lit. And in most of those locations, it talks about an animal that sits next to that fire, which is then understood as the head clan of that territory. It doesn't provide a reference for Sault Ste. Marie, but at Manitoulin Island, there was a white fish. On Beausoleil Island, there was a beaver. At the Narrows of Rama, there was a white-tailed deer. And at the Credit, it talked about a white-headed eagle sitting upon a very tall pine tree that would overlook the rest of those council fires. That nearly the middle of the belt, a wampum was tied onto the belt, and that it had a representation of the sun in the center. We don't know what that image looks like. What I've tried to use here for illustrative and educational purposes is a shell within a shell. So a quahog shell tied onto the wampum with a smaller shell representing that sun in the center, so that the sun would be a witness to all that had taken place, and that every time that we looked up and saw the sun, we would be reminded of the work and acts of our forefathers in re-establishing peace. And so today, I'm sitting just outside Aurelia and resetting the video again. Thank you. Which in the tourism documentation and in many of the city publications refers to Aurelia as the Sunshine City. That did not come from the tourism department. It didn't come from the resorts and the cottages and everything else. That is part of our story, our history, that the sun was hung up in the sky at the Narrows to be a witness to all that had been said and all that had been done. And that when every time we looked to see the sun, we would be reminded of the acts of our forefathers in reconnecting the peace, re-establishing peace during a time of conflict. So how often do we see the sun? Well, beyond some cloudy days here and there, that every day we would be reminded of the importance of peace, to establish peace and maintain peaceful relationships. A challenge for human beings in how we are in our world. But we would be reminded every day, every time that we saw the sun hanging at the Narrows. And so then it was important to establish peace, but not just establish peace, but also the renewal of the peace. So that the renewal of the treaties, these weren't just one and done documents that were created and then set aside and forgotten about, put in an archive, left alone, never touched. That these wampums would come out every number of years, and that relationship would be renewed, that they were living documents. And that was as important as the establishment of peace or reestablishment of the peace during a time of conflict, but that it would not be left there, that they would be brought out again and again, where all of the signatories, all of the parties, all of the nations would be brought back together to renew the relationships. And in that way, not just a political or international diplomacy renewal, but they were sessions to then be able to educate the generations that were following in the footsteps of the ones that had actually done the work to establish those peaceful relationships. I'm going to have time for maybe one more to slide in here and talk a little bit about. And this particular wampum comes from 1764. It comes at the conclusion of a conference of peace that was held at Fort Niagara, which is now on the American side of the imaginary line, but in those days, the imaginary line wasn't quite the way it was as it is today. And so it's important then, because this is connected to what is referred historically in Canadian studies as the Pontiac War or the Pontiac Uprising. Again, another change time for Indigenous peoples, where the British had pushed the French out of what was then New France and began to exert their presence, we'll say. Be cautious in my choice of words. And so in doing that, disregarded all the diplomacy that had been established between Indigenous nations and the French. And so that led to conflict. So it's important to have an understanding or some teachings around Pontiac War, Pontiac Uprising. And so what happens then is Indigenous peoples in the Eastern Woodland, north of the St. Lawrence, north of the Great Lakes, push back against the British and stop them in their tracks as they advance and try to exert themselves here in this section, this portion of the Eastern Woodland. And so when that happens, the British then are essentially forced to enter into peaceful negotiations if they want to continue here in the Eastern Woodland. And that comes about through the Treaty of Fort Niagara of 1764. That takes place in July and August of the summer of 1764, and there were 24 different nations that traveled to Fort Niagara to enter into discussions and negotiations with Sir William Johnson. And this is one of the wampum that come from the Treaty of Fort Niagara. So Linda's going to help me here. We need to move back a little bit from the computer monitor to be able to have enough distance to be able to see the wampum. So give us a minute. So we do get a little bit washed out. If you could just move that way a little bit. Okay, just a little bit. This wampum is about 7 feet long. I hope people can still hear me. I'll try and use my outdoor playground voice now that I'm standing away from the wampum. So we can see it is quite large. We can see on this end the 17 and the 64 denoting the year. When the British become involved and fully participating in wampum diplomacy, things change in wampum diplomacy. And we see the addition of numbers and letters, and we see a number of other changes as well. So on the far end of the wampum, we see two diamond figures, the 17 and the 64. These images, when we do a presentation, again in grade schools, the students always want to know how come there's goggles or glasses on the wampum. These are representations of the Silver Covenant chain. So years before this, the British had already entered into wampum relationship with Iroquoian peoples south of the St. Lawrence, south of the Great Lakes, through a Silver Covenant chain relationship. At 1764, when the British were stopped in their tracks in this region of the Eastern Woodland, they fell back onto that metaphor, that symbol of the Silver Covenant chain, and wanted to extend the Silver Covenant chain of peace and friendship to what they referred to as the Western Confederacy. So the West was not out west. It was not British Columbia. It was not Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. There was a line that went from around Thunder Bay, Straits of Michilimackinac, down to Detroit. And that was the Western frontier in 1764. And so the British referred to those Anishinaabe peoples as the Western Confederacy, wanting to extend that Silver Covenant chain of peace and friendship. We see the two human figures in the middle of the belt with their hands bound in wampum. They are bound together in their relationship. We see the different marks in the chest, one representing the newcomers, one representing Indigenous peoples. The chain continues on this side. We see the 1764, the chain links continue. And we see this partial image here. There we go, if I get the glare of the sun off of that. And it just kind of seems to end. And the diamonds on this end also seem to be unfinished. But if we were able to, one of the understandings about this wampum, if we could stand it up on its own and form it into a circle, then the diamond on this end would complete the diamond forms on the other end of the wampum. And one of the things that were talked about at the Treaty of Fort Niagara is that the Silver Covenant chain of peace and friendship would never end. Would never end, that the relationship would be forever. And so this wampum, as the two ends connect and complete each other, forms a circle, a never-ending circle, to talk about that relationship between the newcomers and Indigenous peoples. And so one of the things I think that's important to talk about, and especially for our non-Indigenous relatives that may be on our session or on our call today, that these wampums are not only related to Indigenous peoples here. That our settler friends, our new arrival friends, this is their wampum that was presented on their behalf to the Indigenous peoples of the Eastern Woodland. to enter into a silver covenant chain of peace and friendship that would last as long as the rivers flowed, as long as the grasses grew, as long as the sun would shine, that this relationship was to be forever and unending. So that these stories just don't concern Indigenous peoples, and that these wampums don't concern only Indigenous peoples, but for everybody here that lives in this land has a responsibility through a wampum relationship. You may not know that. You may not have heard these stories before, but here is the document where it was recorded. And so if we have this understanding, maybe then that has an impact on how we look at reconciliation, on how we look at renewing the treaty relationships, that we begin to have a better understanding of what it means that we are all treaty people. We know that Indigenous peoples have continued to hold up their end of the bargain, their end of the responsibility and the relationship. But we don't think that that has continued to happen for the newcomers. And so we want to share some of these stories with you today to get you thinking about that, to get you to consider that what does reconciliation look like as you begin to grasp your end of the wampum and to renew that relationship, to breathe life back into that before the face of the sun that was witness to all that had been done by our forefathers. And so that we would be reminded every time that we saw the sun about our responsibilities of living a peaceful coexistence. So I think I've just about wound out of time. And so I'm going to turn it back over. And I want to thank you for listening. I hope I've been able to share some stories that were interesting to you and have given you something to think about. And that I am hopeful that the time that you spent with us here today has been a worthwhile use of your time. I know we're all busy. I know we all have lots of work to do. But I hope that the contribution I've been able to share with you today has been worthwhile of your time and commitment in sitting in front of your particular screen or your handheld device. So, miigwech for the opportunity. I appreciate being here and being able to offer these things with you today. And again, I hope it has been worthwhile time for you. I will now turn the screen back over to Denise and to our elder. There may be some questions, but I'll let Denise take care of that process. But I will say miigwech, and I appreciate being here. I appreciate you sharing this time with us.
Miigwech. Thank you so much, Brian, for sharing with us today. A few comments that we got in the chat. They were beautiful, first of all. And I know in the past I have had the opportunity to sit with you in person and actually, look at those belts on a much closer scale. Doug said, thank you so much for a clear understanding of wampum and its political use. We need to understand this as a reconciliation building tool. Robert made a comment and had a short question, which maybe we can address prior to the closing with Elder Jean. Robert says, miigwech for your talk. I gather there is no wampum or Indigenous equivalent associated with the Robinson Treaties of 1850, despite being used in 1812. If not, what is the significance of such absence of symbols of Indigenous diplomacy and agreement for the relationship?
Well, there is actually wampum that does relate to those treaties, but maybe not specifically to Robinson-Huron Treaty. But there is wampum in place that guide those discussions and the responsibilities that were in place before that treaty was, how would we say that, concluded, maybe. I mean, I think it's a much broader question when we begin talking about those treaties, which gets a little challenging. That quite often there are numerous treaties that were signed on blank pieces of paper, that there were treaties where discussions took place at Treaty Council, and then when the treaty negotiators, the government representatives went away, they completely rewrote all of the contents of those documents that was discussed. Keep in mind that Indigenous peoples in Canada were not allowed to hire lawyers until mid-1900s, okay? So many different things that we get into around the issues of treaty, but there were wampum in place that were guiding the relationship that were then, I don't want to make blanket statements, that were then likely not honored by treaty negotiators and the government of the day. And again, blanket statement, every succeeding government of the day.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. So I'm going to now invite Elder Jean Nawagizik, who opened us Treaty Week this year, 2021 on Monday, and has actually been with us every single day. I've seen him on Zoom, interacting, listening, and taking part in all of the discussions with our various guest speakers this week. Elder Jean Nawagizik is from Kaskazing Anishinaabe. And he is a direct descendant of one of the original signatories on the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. And I would like to invite Elder Jean to do the closing for today. Welcome, Elder Jean.
Thank you very much for being part of this week's Treaty Week. I'm always interested and fascinated by the stories and history and proof of the treaty. And I'd like to say Chimiglitz for that elder that just shared some wampums. I know I talked about the War of 1812. My relatives on the Treaty of 1850 and the War of 1812 participation. I understand that there are medals out there that were issued to them, you know, as being allies to the British, you know, on that 1812. So I know that part of the history, you know, through my family and the medals that they received. And just Jimmy, let's for that. I'm going to do some prayers. I understand that some of the speakers, one of the speakers talked about the sacred pipe and the sacred ceremonies that were part of the incorporation of these treaties. I know when you read the Robinson Huron Treaty documents, and Robinson talks about after the signing of a treaty, all the Indians got drunk and, you know, just barely get on the boat to get back to their communities. I think that's a lie. You know, my people always carry pipes and medicines when they do business, you know, so I think that's not all true, you know. And for that, I will close with prayer, and I want to acknowledge in my prayer that all the participants and all the chiefs in our country, and that they continue to strive for the truth, you know, of what happened. You know, we didn't hear too much about how many Anishinaabe people were in this part of the world. Understanding there was over 100 million indigenous people in Turtle Island at one point. And then we look at it today, we're probably less than 10 million, you know, Aboriginal people in this country. And just to tell, you know, just a few that survived, you know, we have the genetics, we have the knowledge, we have the spirit to continue, you know, when we talk about how resilient we are. We're still here. I believe in the beliefs that I grew up with, that Creator will protect us and will bring back all the Anishinaabe people we lost over the years. I believe that. So when we pray and sign new agreements, that we should never lose sight of that. That's, I've been talking like this for the last years that I've been living and continue to, for the truth, truth and reconciliation now is a new word, but Anishinaabe people always walked with the truth, the Southern grandfather teachings. To me, Rich, Denise, I appreciate that. And I will close with a prayer, and people will journey on in a beautiful way. Rich. Mashomis, Constage Nakas, Sema, Pogan, Gid Monak. Chimi Rich, one on Kagijak. Chimi Rich, one on Kagagi Dot. The Noy Magnak, which can't Mashomis. Wish. One and all one Nakmak Twang, one on give me sec. Wow. If she sec, no, the gig, the ambigi. Which we do cause young in with more Anishinaabe and the Madzit. Numquen Mark Gemakanak, Gemak, Wogan Minaga, Mono, and the Sabgidakis go Wika, Wiki, Rajab Musang, Anishinaabe Madzit. Chimigwitkin in Numquenamak in Wabinong the key in the Magnana key and the Khaniasat, Gabi, Kiwit, and the shower. Once me rich, who need the Nagagi or the Nagash the Jan saw the Magnot, not the sword and the Shomus. Me rich. Thank you, and I love you all. That's it.
Good, Sheldon Algizik. So nice that you were able to join us all week. I look forward to seeing you again in real life rather than just on Zoom all the time. I would like to extend deep gratitude to Brian Charles for joining us today and for sharing and speaking with us, and for Dr. Linda Rodenberg, who helped keep this all together in Aurelia, where they're located today. For those of you who are able to join us in Thunder Bay on Monday, November 8th at 12:15 in the Agora, we are going to be hosting Indigenous Veterans ceremony. And we have an exhibit that is a compilation of exhibit artifacts from the Thunder Bay Museum, Manitou Mounds, Treaty 3, and the Métis Nation of Ontario. And we have a short 30-minute presentation where we have the leader of the Métis Veterans Association joining us, Chief Peter Collins joining us, the representatives from the Thunder Bay Museum, the Royal Scottish Armory, and our own Dr. David Barnett. So we hope that if you can make it on Monday at 12:15, please do. Just be mindful that we have the mobile safety app at Lakehead University. And also the exhibit will be in the Agora all week. So with that, we wish everybody a safe, happy, healthy Friday and enjoyable weekend. Miigwech.